Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Brittany Lewis, and I am the Security Operations Supervisor for Travel Guard. And I want to thank everyone for joining us today for a discussion on travel safety for students and for waiting a few minutes while we logged on. Before we meet our speakers, I want to note that we'll be answering questions at the end of this webcast, so you can submit questions through the platform anytime during the presentation. All right, so welcome everyone. Would you like to introduce yourselves? Let's start with Chris Griffin.
Hi there, my name's Chris Griffin. I'm in post as the Director of Organisational Risk and Resilience for the University of Southampton in England. So I oversee responses to incidents abroad and student travel. So before that, I worked for the University of Warwick, and before that, I was a probation officer for a long time, or a parole officer. And nice to meet you all. Thanks for joining.
Hello, everyone. I'm Ed Salvato. I am in New York. I use he, him pronouns. Thank you for inviting me to participate in this important discussion with such esteemed fellow panelists. I am a professor of hospitality and tourism at New York University. I'm also an LGBTQ marketing specialist, helping destinations, hotels, and other travel brands authentically engage with LGBTQ travelers. Delighted to be here.
Hello, I'm Sheryl Hill. I'm the founder and originator of Depart Smart Travel Safety Information. It's an honor and a privilege. Thank you for having me.
Hi, everyone. My name is Juliana Crim, and I am the Global Travel Safety Manager at Rice University here in Houston, Texas. I also worked at Travel Guard for almost 7 years as an Africa analyst, editor, and ultimately for the last almost 5 years, the Senior Security Intelligence Advisor.
And welcome back, Juliana, on the other side of the camera this time.
Yeah.
So let's first talk a little bit about why we speak about travel safety for students separately from other travelers. We hope that today is going to kind of help elucidate that a little bit. But really the easiest way to explain why we single out students is because it is, students are a vulnerable population. They face different risks whenever they travel as compared to your standard business traveler or a retired leisure traveler with tons of experience. So while I recognize that every traveler is different, they're going to have different experience levels overall. Right off the bat, we see students maybe not having the huge budget to stay in, really nice hotels and use private transportation and things like that. And we're also going to see students choosing different activities that, perhaps raise their risk profile. So that's why we like to discuss some of the unique risks that they face whenever they're traveling. So let's go ahead and get into it. And we'll start with Sheryl. So Sheryl, I would actually like to, give you a moment to speak a little bit about Depart Smart and its relationship to Travel Guard. How did that come about?
Thank you, Brittany. Depart Smart Travel Safety Training is a collaboration of hundreds of college and high school students, along with international travel safety and education experts, culminating from more than 15 years of tragic experiences, including the preventable death of our 16-year-old son, Tyler Hill, on a student trip to Japan in 2007. Travel Guard has been an unparalleled sponsor of our life-saving award-winning efforts for over a decade and is the catalyst behind Depart Smart's successful launch. During the global pandemic and travel ban, Travel Guard stepped up to acquire Depart Smart and take it to the next level. It's very exciting.
And Sheryl, I just want to thank you personally for, first of all, being a wonderful partner to Travel Guard, and also for taking what no parent should have to experience and turning it into something so positive and so empowering for all of the student travelers out there.
Thank you.
So let's move into pre-trip planning. That is one of the most important parts of travel safety overall. Um, and I'd like to know from Juliana, how can we help engage student travelers in the process of that planning phase?
So as part of my role, I do risk assessments for any student travel to high risk locations. And I like to start that process by just having a meeting with the student to hear them out and learn more about their trip. Taking the time to have that two-way conversation is really important because I want to make sure that they feel heard by me. And during that meeting, we will talk through different things or issues that could come up. And I ask the student to think about what risks or problems they might encounter and how they can handle them. The reason why I ask them to come up with the answers themselves is so that they feel invested in their safety. I can talk all day to somebody about their travel risks, and ultimately they may or may not remember what I am saying. But if the student is doing their own research and critical thinking about it, they're more likely to remember and comply because it kind of forces them to understand the risks and implications better. We need the student to, quote unquote, buy into the idea of travel safety. And the best way that I can think of is for them to be actively involved in the pre-trip planning process.
That makes a lot of sense. Ed, let's go to you. What do you think about this topic?
Echoing Juliana, pre-trip planning is crucial, especially for LGBTQ and gender non-conforming travelers who may face unique risks. To engage students, I encourage them to approach this as a form of self-advocacy, researching cultural, legal, and social norms in the destination not only helps them stay safe, but also allows them to feel more confident and in control of the journey. For example, LGBTQ students should know whether their destination is one of the more than 60 countries with laws criminalizing same-sex relationships or gender expression, as well as whether there are local resources like queer-friendly support networks or safe spaces. LGBTQ or pride centers can be found all over the world and are usually a safe sanctuary. Providing students with trusted resources like ILGA's world maps of LGBTQ rights or travel advisories tailored to marginalized groups can make the research feel actionable and empowering. Also, they'll want to check out IGLTA's online listing of queer-friendly tourism suppliers, such as tour guides and hotels, as well as queer content creators or influencers who've traveled to and posted about many global destinations.
So Ed, you've touched on one of my favorite topics, which is profile-based pre-trip research. I'm very exciting at parties. But I'd really like to know your thoughts on that in a little bit more depth. How important is it to consider your profile when researching a trip?
Absolutely essential to consider your personal profile, especially for queer travelers. For instance, as I said, understanding the legal status of homosexuality or gender expression in a destination can mean the difference between a safe trip and a potentially dangerous situation. While legal status doesn't necessarily imply danger, it's still important to know. Travelers should research whether identification papers, including passports, need to match their appearance or gender presentation, as this can cause complications during security checks or when accessing services. In Italy, for example, hotels must report identifying information of their guests to the local police precinct that is usually based on a photo of a passport, which has a gender marker, which may or may not match the gender expression of the person checking in. Super subtle detail, but also a potential cause of confusion, embarrassment, or much worse.
Yeah, and I think that brings up a really good point. For one, I do think if your gender marker doesn't match your presentation, um, a doctor's note is always a good idea, especially if you're traveling through airports. But if you are able to update your identification before travel, obviously that is the best course of action. It can't always be done. It's very difficult, and a lengthy process for some. So I think it's important in that situation to, first understand your rights as a traveler. For example, in the US, there are certain things that TSA agents can and cannot do. And if they don't necessarily have the training to go along with those regulations, you can request a supervisor. And I think there's another important point, which is it's not just about the laws. It's also about what the social norms and attitudes are. So maybe you're going to a country that is more permissive, but you also have to take into account some of those societal norms that, may be a little bit less a little bit less easy to find when you're doing pre-trip research.
Absolutely correct on both sides of that. The documentation and research on that is super important, but also the social norms. It can really vary quite a bit from destination to destination, and it can be misaligned, so to speak, with the legal status. Social norms, super important. In some places, subtle behaviors or expressions can be misinterpreted. Proactively identifying destinations that are welcoming or at least neutral toward queer travelers and gender non-conforming travelers help ensure students can focus on the joy of their experience without constantly navigating unwelcome or unsafe environments.
Yes, very good point, Ed. And, I think for a lot of people, pre-trip research can feel a little bit overwhelming. Probably not for our panelists. I think everyone here is relatively well seasoned in that respect. But if you're just starting out, there really are tons of resources online, and you do have to know where to find them. So really a good place to start is always with government travel advice pages, in my opinion. So you've got the US Department of State, but you also have other government sites like the UK Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. And I like to actually use a selection of those because I think that they all have a little bit of information that differs from one to the other. And if you use multiple sources, you can get a really good overview of a location by kind of piecing everything together. Something that I do, revealing my trade secrets, is just doing a simple search of the name of your destination and the words travel safety. That's going to pull up a ton of results, including pretty much all of the government advice pages that would exist for that location. From there on, you can kind of go into more in-depth searches. And, for me, I've been able to find things all the way from considerations for traveling with prescription medications all the way to specific country-related regulations around evacuating when you have pets. So there is a ton of information out there. Start with the sort of broader picture and then work your way in as you learn while you're doing that research. So let's go to Chris. I'd like to talk about what you think institutions could do to ensure that they're preparing to support students abroad.
Thank you. And I think so when I was thinking about this question, what felt really important to me is the stages. So I think institutions can do things before students travel, when they're traveling abroad, and when there's trouble when they're traveling, and then when they get back in terms of lessons learned. So in terms of preparing students or being able to prepare students, good pre-travel risk assessment is key. And the University of Southampton and universities in the UK should make sure that we communicate our insurance requirements, our pre-travel risk assessments, and our escalation processes and methodology, so that if students need support abroad, they know when and where and how. So the pre-travel is really important. I think alongside that, certainly at Southampton, it's really important for us to have good internal procedures. So if a student is in trouble abroad, do the department know who to contact and when and how? When does central services take control of an incident that a department might have been managing autonomously? So it's all about good escalation, good information sharing proactively between departments, so that we're aware of the risks and any vulnerabilities. I think really importantly for preparation to support students abroad is to have a clear risk appetite. So colleagues have mentioned the FCDO, so the Foreign and Commonwealth Development Office. So if the, which is government led, if the government advised against all travel to a country, then that is the University of Southampton's risk appetite. So we would not be supporting travel to a country under any circumstances where the FCDO recommend against all travel at all costs. So I think good risk appetite is really important, and the kind of an awareness of risk impact and likelihood, and a willingness to say no proactively to safeguard our student community is really important.
Again, another very good point, considering individual risk profiles as well as risk tolerances is key. So Sheryl, tell me a little bit about what kind of advice you would give to parents who are helping their students to prepare for a trip.
Thank you. My favorite subject. For parents specifically, my strongest advice is to be sure as emergency contacts, you have active powers of attorney to advocate for your child, and that you have active passports good for at least a year beyond the student's date of return. You must always travel insured. That includes you if you have to get there. Insurance protects you in the probability of an eventuality. You should have digital copies of your travel insurance policies, and you should know how to use them. You should have an emergency preparedness plan that you created with your student. If a U.S. citizen registers their trip with the U.S. Department of State, which Brittany mentioned earlier, there are those resources from practically every country. That's at travel.state.gov. And you and your student, along with the study abroad program, will get alerts and warnings and calls to actions for support if you need them. You and your student should do this for yourselves. Your study abroad program should not register for you at the state. This is a lifetime skill, and it's helped me so many times. I believe in visiting a travel clinic, you'd be surprised how many health risks there are out there and how many prophylaxis there are to avoid those risks. Some of those include vaccines. You should know the embassy address and the telephone number and the emergency numbers in the destination for fire, police, and ambulance, and of course, how to ask for help if you're at that destination. You should store important documents in the cloud, your power of attorney, your travel insurance policy, your passports, your driver's license, your credit card, and you should have a way to pay for large expenditures if you have to prepay for healthcare, for example. You should have alternative calling plans, unlocked cell phones, calling cards, perhaps a satellite phone in remote areas, a date and time to check in on a regular basis where you see your child's face, not just a text, and having a code for conversation. In my opinion, legal counsel is called that for a reason. And an unfortunate event occurs, access to legal counsel can protect you and the ones you love. Travel abroad safety is a lot like driving a car. Once you have the basics down and the skills, and you form those safety habits, you have a safety net for when life happens. Safety is not luck. It takes a little planning. Thank you.
Thank you, Sheryl. And I apologize, I think you cut out a little bit, but it was an important point that you were making to set a code word whenever you are checking in. That's really important, especially now when we see a lot of, scams related to virtual kidnapping and things like that. Being able to verify that you are speaking to your loved one is really important. And a family password is always something that is good to have in the event of an emergency. Another thing that I'll jump on that Sheryl said is with respect to registration of your travel with your respective government, that is really important. And many governments are very good about putting that information out there when they have, travel warnings and things of that nature. But there are some messages that go through those particular channels that never really make it to the public. And those can include things like evacuation flights from countries where, there is some form of, crisis, whether it is weather related or political, etc. So it is very important to register your travel if you are able to, so that you can get those sorts of messages that the general public isn't going to see. And I think that's a very good segue into emergency response. Obviously, we've talked about pre-trip planning, but it is also very important for institutions themselves to have the proper infrastructure in place to respond in emergencies. So, with respect to the kind of overall mechanisms that study abroad departments can put into place, Chris, can you talk a little bit about how they can effectively manage their program?
Yeah, so I think for study abroad departments, it's really important that they're aware of wider governance planning processes to support students who might need support in an emergency. So at Southampton, we have a major incident plan, and we encourage study abroad departments to be aware of it, to circulate it, so that we know that they're aware of how we respond to incidents and what they can expect for us. I think also for study abroad departments, it'll be really important to have a methodology to understand who is where. So higher education institutions will have students all over the world. So we need a local and wider university processes and methodologies to understand who is where so that we can coordinate quickly. I think key to any emergency response is recovery. So we want to enter recovery quickly. So if we have a good situational awareness of where our students are via our study abroad department, we can support them quickly enter the recovery phase as we can expedite that process so that we don't spend days trying to understand who is where. And I think a wider, and it's a university responsibility in terms of study abroad departments being able to support good emergency responses is around having a good level of risk literacy at the university. So they should be aware of common good practice, excuse me, for safe travel abroad, how to escalate issues, and how to match resources to risk and need in terms of what countries are we more worried about, and what's our evidence base for that assessment.
Talk a little bit about how institutions should actually respond in an emergency.
Yeah, sure. So I'll break this down into three sections really, and I think it's about preparing, reacting, and learning. So all universities, I suppose, best practice would be to prepare. So as I've said before, in summary, really, is to make our students aware of our insurance provisions, risk assessment procedures, and escalation procedures before they travel. So we need to be completing risk assessments, and those risk assessments need to match resource should follow risk. So higher impact areas require a greater deal of risk assessment. So that kind of embedded risk assessment for high impact locations. As I've said earlier, we need a defined risk appetite. So we will say no to travel if the assessed risks to anyone in our community are too high. And I think it's important to have that. Important to prepare in the context of making departments aware of how they escalate issues abroad. And finally, I suppose before I move on to react, a good major incident plan is key. So, the University of Southampton's plan considers gold, silver, and bronze responsibility. So there's a command and control structure, delegated authority, access to finances quickly, your 24/7 provision if we need it. And this plan is reviewed and governed regularly, so that we're aware of what we can expect and how an incident transitions from a department into central oversight. So I spoke a bit there about preparing. Now I'll speak a little bit about reacting. So if there is an incident, as I've said, we've got an incident response plan that's tested and embedded, so we can deal with issues. That sets out that chain of command and a strategy. So we'll have roles and responsibilities for the gold, silver, and bronze team managing an incident with clearly defined strategic objectives and clearly defined roles within teams, so that communication is clear and not clouded or coming from different sources, and that all teams know what they should be doing. Any good incident response in terms of reaction should be collaborative. So we work with a multitude of departments to support our students when they're in trouble abroad. But finally, we record. I think really important to record information, actions, and decisions so that we have an evidence base. So if our decision making during an incident abroad is questioned, we can provide an evidence base to the local authority or the statutory service that request it. So really key. And once the incident has been dealt with successfully, we hope, a really important part, and one that I find often gets left, is the learning. So we need to review the incident and identify lessons to learn. What did we do well, but more importantly, what could we do differently? they need action plans, high level action plans and summaries. So actually, what's the learning here? What will we do different next time? So that review process, so that we review our documentation and procedures to evidence we've learned lessons. I think really important is to take ownership of any gaps and seek to mitigate or escalate. So there might be some gaps in response that we can do something about, but if there's not, escalate those gaps via formal risk assessment procedures.
And that's such a good point, Chris. After any crisis response that we do on my team, we go through and do a thorough assessment of how we performed, the good and the bad. And it's not about pointing fingers and making everyone feel bad. It's about understanding that there's always something to learn. You can always do better. The travel risk space is such a dynamic area, and so there's never something that there's never going to be something that you haven't prepared for. And I think with respect to kind of understanding that things change over time, new processes can be put into place to enhance the things that you already have. I think it's very important. So that kind of reflection is definitely key. And I think we might have Juliana back. Juliana?
Yes, I am here.
So why don't we actually go on and talk a little bit about what students should do to prepare for an emergency?
So I would say that the first and probably most important step is to organize all of your important information. So before you go, know where you can find emergency contact info, insurance info, and make yourself aware of who to contact and what to do in case an emergency arises. Also, familiarize yourself with the resources that are available to you as a student if you're part of a program, or through your travel insurance if you're taking a personal trip. It's best to go ahead and do this at the outset before any issues arise so that you aren't trying to find bits and pieces of important information in the middle of an emergency.
And Sheryl, let's talk a little bit about how parents can respond in an emergency.
I think it's unanimous from the panel that we all agree that having a documented emergency preparedness plan that you personally created with your child is paramount. You can rely on your consulate and the embassy and sometimes local authorities, and you should be the first person to contact your insurance company for advice and support. But again, if you're a U.S. citizen, being pre-registered in travel.state.gov, or if you're not in the U.S., registering with your own embassy gives you a heads up to avoid risks. I love how Travel Guard has put all of this information in a logical, comprehensive way so that people can find us. Thank you for doing that.
Our pleasure, Sheryl. And I think it's important to discuss a little bit about what you can expect from your travel insurance company whenever you have to respond to an emergency. Now, to be fair, I can only speak for Travel Guard, and I am on the assistant side, so not a lot of policy experience there, but essentially in any sort of emergency, your travel assistance company is going to go through the case intake process, and they are going to assess whether medical, security, or general assistance services are required, or maybe it's some combination of those. And I think it's important to note, and this is for parents, students, institutions, whoever. Emergency response is a collaborative process. It is important for organizations to first have their own well-defined protocols so that they understand how they're going to communicate and make decisions within their organization, and factoring in how to work best with their insurance and assistance provider. So With respect to the decision making, I think that that is probably the most important. You don't want to have delays when it comes to financial decisions and decisions on where to evacuate someone to and things of that nature. So those sorts of protocols are very important. It's also very important to test your plan on a regular basis. If you don't have an active crisis response that you can sort of evaluate the way that Chris and I discussed, having some sort of test, at least on a yearly basis, is very good for that continued assessment. And I would also like to note that there are services that may be included within your travel insurance policy that don't necessarily correspond to an actual emergency. There are some pre-trip planning resources, for example, that may be available to you. And I think it's important to take advantage of any resources that are there. Check and see what your policy includes, and if there's something that you can take advantage of that's going to help you in that planning phase. So I'd actually like to move into some personal experiences, because I think that's such an important thing for people to take into account. We're talking about the things that we've learned throughout our time in this space. So do any of our speakers have a real life example of an emergency situation to share?
I'd be happy to. So yeah, an example, I worked at a university prior to the University of Southampton. I oversaw incident management for staff and students. And this incident was involving students. So there was a coup in a South American country where our students were based. So a lot of political unrest and unsafety. So we drew together our major incident team via our major incident plan, and we were trying to understand who is where. And I think that was the first lesson learned. We had students all over this country, and it was really difficult to identify where. So the first lesson identified, I should say, was right. We need a better methodology to understand who is where. So once we understood and we who was where, we were able to outreach students to ascertain their welfare and well-being and to see who wanted to come home. Or needed to come home based on risk and need. So to do this, we had our major incident team established, and very briefly, so it's gold, silver and bronze. So gold is strategy, our executive board. Silver is where I sit, tactical. Bronze is on the ground. On the ground was difficult because it was abroad. But what we did was we established a risk appetite. So we didn't want to bring every single student home. Some were hundreds of miles away from the coup. Wanted to give them the option, but as long as we assessed that they were safe, we wanted to allow some flexibility there. So not a generic approach for all. It was considered risk and need. So we established risk appetite, decided that we wanted to bring a percentage of our students home safely, decided that a strategic priority would be about clear comms internally and externally. So we funneled all communications through the major incident team so that we had one source of truth. And our final strategic priority was to support family members and make them aware of what we were doing. So we found that the kind of having strategic priorities allowed us to work in scope of these, and we had a consistent approach that put our students first. We used a gold, silver and bronze command and control structure to meet daily to oversee progress and towards our achievement of our strategic goals. And as I said before, we were able to identify who was where, communicate with them about their needs, and we've tailored our response via our insurers based on individual risk and need. And as a result of this, we were able to bring home a percentage of our students. So from the most impacted areas, we arranged emergency flights for them. But there were students in other parts of the country that weren't directly impacted by this political unrest that we felt didn't need to come back, and they didn't want to come back. So the result was clear communication with our, I suppose, internal and external facing bodies, prioritization of the safety of our student population, and following a kind of clear structure and clear risk appetite, and bringing our students back safely for the ones that needed to come home. So it's kind of quite a successful incident. But again, as we spoke about before, also a really good chance to learn lessons about how do we identify who is where quickly.
Anyone else?
Yes. So when I was in grad school, I did a study year in Poland. And one day when I was there, I just randomly got sick. I had no idea what was going on, and I had no idea what to do. And I had not paid really any attention at all to the resources that were available to me. And I didn't even know how to get medical attention. And to top it all off, my Polish wasn't very good. So I couldn't really even ask anyone. Eventually, I had talked to my landlord and she ended up calling an ambulance. But when the ambulance got there, they refused to transport me to the hospital. I didn't really understand why. I think maybe because I hadn't already seen a doctor. But luckily, my friends were able to find a doctor who would make a house call, and the doctor was able to get me transported to the hospital. And I ended up staying there for about a week, and it was really tough. I had a hard time communicating with the medical staff, most of whom did not speak English. And I didn't know basic things like the fact that I needed to provide my own water to drink during my stay. And thankfully, somebody who was in the shared room that I was in took pity on me and gave me a water bottle until my friend was able to bring me some supplies. But in hindsight, I realized that I could and really should have contacted the international student office at the university I was studying at, but that didn't even occur to me at the time. I was sick and alone and scared, and I was so unwell that I literally couldn't even read things on my phone. So after about a week, I was released from the hospital and I wasn't sure how to file an insurance claim to pay for my stay. I was young. I'd never dealt with insurance at all in my entire life. And I vaguely remembered that my school had given us a link to their study abroad website during orientation. I don't remember them explaining it in detail at all, but I was able to find the travel insurance information there. And funnily enough, it was actually Travel Guard insurance. So I was acquainted with the business before I even started working at Travel Guard. But anyways, I really would have benefited from an explanation of how to use the policy instead of just receiving the link. But that's also on me because I really should have taken it upon myself to review the page and pulled the important information about it from the trip. But it really just wasn't something that I even thought about doing.
Yeah, I actually think that brings up a very good point. When it comes to using insurance, it really is very helpful to contact your insurance provider, your assistance company, as early as possible. No one is ever going to be upset at anyone for being as proactive as possible. So, obviously, I'm glad that everything ended up working out well for you. But certainly understanding how that process works, again, what resources you have available as a student traveler, and when is best to make contact. And typically it's before you go to the hospital if you're not in a dire emergency. Those are always important things to consider. So Sheryl, do you
Yes, of
have
course.
any words of wisdom?
So when our son Tyler died, the U.S. consulate in Tokyo was invaluable in helping us with a lot of red tape to repatriate his remains. That was hard. In another case, and to your point, we had a student who had travel insurance but did not know how to use it. They called emergency services, which sent in a very remote area, they sent a rickety ambulance along dirt roads for a broken hip that took hours, instead of first calling Travel Guard for their assistance in coordinating a medical airlift. That mistake cost them hours of discomfort, which could have all been avoided if they would have called their travel insurance company prior. So, good point.
Thank you, everyone. And so now I have another question for you about your own experiences when you were studying abroad. What do you know now that you wish you had known at that time?
I guess I could jump in. I wish I had known how much my identity as a gay traveler could influence my experience. At the time, I didn't fully appreciate the need to research local attitudes, laws, or even potential risks of simply being myself in a new destination. For example, I remember feeling uncomfortable in a few instances, but didn't have the tools to understand why or how to navigate those situations safely. At the time, I wasn't fully out. Plus, there weren't online resources or even pride centers, so I was mostly on my own. Still, I wish I had spoken to our college study abroad administration before heading out, or ideally, perhaps they could have surfaced this information for me proactively.
Anyone else?
So for me, like I was hinting at in my story about going to the hospital in Poland, I really wish that I had just taken the time to prepare beforehand. When I was a student in my early 20s, I really didn't take things seriously. I was very content to just show up and figure things out as I went, but it would have been a lot easier for me physically, mentally, and emotionally if I had done literally any research before I left. I could have avoided a number of sticky situations that I had stumbled into by accident. And I would also have gotten a lot more out of my experience in terms of knowing what things that I would have liked to see and do. I just really didn't feel a strong sense of agency back then. And I wish that I had.
Yeah, I agree. For me, I wish that I understood that there were no laws that govern or oversee global travel safety, even for study abroad programs. No department of the United States or many countries has any jurisdiction of student study abroad programs. There's no legal recourse. You'll rarely, if ever, get a warning before you buy or depart. Our water bottles have more safety warnings. Safety is not luck, but it takes effort, but it can save a life. Students must do their own travel safety preparedness plan to gain those skills to travel safely for a lifetime. That's why it's called Depart Smart.
Thank you, Cheryl. And I think it's important to note in terms of standardization, up until a certain point, travel risk management didn't necessarily have a standard to go by. I think there were, best practices that were sort of recognized across the board. But I believe in 2021, the Organization for International Standards came out with ISO 31030. And that is actually a travel safety management, travel risk management international standard. So this is more for institutions, of course, but it is worth noting that there is, some guidance out there now on, the best practices for infrastructure and response. And it does include annexes that discuss student travel safety specifically. There's sort of an addendum standard that has come out more recently just for student travelers, but I believe it focuses a little bit more on student travelers who are 18 and under. So it may not necessarily be applicable to every organization. So can anyone tell me a little bit about some of the things that you wish your study abroad program had done differently?
I can jump in. As I just mentioned, I wish my study abroad program had directly addressed the needs of LGBTQ, a gay student in this case. There was little to no guidance on issues like navigating cultural legal barriers, finding queer-friendly spaces or activities, including bars or clubs, or just the ability to meet others like myself. So it wasn't that long ago in the grand scheme of things, but it was like the dark ages. So having a webinar like this organized by Travel Guard would have been unthinkable, really, but still they should have provided some information. Now programs really need to offer tailored resources such as information about queer-friendly destinations, housing options, local advocacy organizations and the like. Even something as simple as hosting a pre-departure session that includes diverse perspectives would have gone a long way in making me feel seen and supported.
Anyone else?
Well, I've done study abroad through 2 different universities. Both times, I don't think that they really did a ton to prepare us before we went. I do remember the schools both requiring that everybody go to a general pre-travel meeting with all of the other students doing study abroad that year. And at the meetings, they basically just gave super, super general advice that honestly didn't apply to a lot of the audience. Like, for example, I remember at one of them hearing a piece of advice that nobody should ride a bike abroad because it's unsafe and you could get into an accident. And I remember looking over and seeing a group of students that was going to the Netherlands to do study abroad. And they were just like very visibly confused because that's the main mode of transportation. And I also wish that there had been more of an emphasis on the cultural aspect of what to expect, because the first time I did study abroad, I felt a pretty strong culture shock. And there were a lot of things that I wasn't aware of that would have been really helpful to know. So during undergrad, I studied abroad in Moscow, which was awesome, but I just didn't know a lot culturally. I was doing an immersive language study abroad, and that was the focus, not culture. So, for example, I didn't know that Russians are generally very stoic and can come off as being kind of cold in public, particularly with people that they don't know, which is completely different from my own culture coming from the southern US. No one on the Moscow metro or at the grocery store or on the street is going to smile at you. And because I didn't know that, it just felt like people were so unfriendly, when in reality, that was just normal. And if you are like me and you are kind of inherently trained to smile at strangers and be friendly, people might find it disingenuous or think you're kind of unhinged or doing something untoward. And it really took quite a while for me to be able to curb my natural instinct to smile and interact with people I ran into like I would back home. And I wish that I had had the time to kind of mentally prepare myself for that and not just stumbled into awkward situations on my own.
Those are really great points. And I think it is extremely important to make sure that the advice that you're giving is realistic. You can't just say, don't go out and go to clubs at night and don't meet new people. That isn't something that is going to help a traveler of any age. And so I think making sure that you're understanding that people are going to do things that maybe are sort of inherently risky when they're traveling. I think it's important to recognize that, and instead of just saying don't do that, give some tips on actually mitigating the associated risks. Anyone else before we move on?
Yeah, thanks. Again, I would love to see all programs in every school actually mandate a standardized travel safety preparedness plan that the student and the parent co-develop together. It helps teach travel safety skills and preparedness for a lifetime. It would be so great if schools taught that, so that students, even for vacation, would have the skills that you're promoting.
Yeah, and I think that there are things that you can do, absent of having that kind of infrastructure in schools, just as a family, and making sure that you're taking those things into account. So, one final question for everyone: how have your own experiences influenced how you manage student travel safety in your current roles?
I can jump in. So my experience has made me deeply aware of how personal identity intersects with safety and travel. I advocate for inclusive preparation and policies that address the specific needs of queer, gender nonconforming students. For example, I encourage institutions to provide destination-specific guides that highlight legal, social, and cultural considerations for queer travelers. I also stress the importance of fostering a supportive environment where students feel comfortable asking questions and sharing concerns about their identity. Also, we should have some training for program administration to be made aware of the needs and concerns of non-normative so to speak, study abroad candidates, so everyone can feel empowered to explore the world safely and confidently.
Yes, I agree. You may never get a second chance to make that right decision, and every traveler in every travel program has a duty of care and a duty to inform. Depart Smart resources can help you fulfill those duties.
I think that my own experiences as a student travel are really valuable to me in my current role, because I remember what it was like when I was their age, not that long ago. And when I was going through similar experiences to what they are or will be. And it really helps me to think about things that would have been valuable to me back then and what would have been a more effective way to communicate the importance of risks and give me as a student a sense of ownership and agency. And I'm able to empathize with them and their experience and potential struggles. And I am a huge advocate of studying abroad during college, because those were really, really formative and character developing times for me.
All right, thank you so much, everyone. And I'm actually going to go ahead and jump into the Q&A portion because we have some really great questions. So the first one is for Sheryl. So Sheryl, you mentioned that parents of internationally traveling students need passports that are valid for a full year past the student's return date. Could you explain why that is? For example, why would it be more appropriate for a year as opposed to 2 months post travel dates?
So my own personal tragedy is my real-time story. When Tyler died, my passport was good for, I think, 4.5 months beyond the date that I was traveling out. And I thought I was good. And my younger son's passport was good for a month. He was not able to travel with me. So I had to leave him behind as I went to try and advocate for Tyler. The only way that I got on the plane was that I was able to call my congressman, who called the embassy and worked on my behalf, because I was going to recover Tyler, not to stay or vacation. So in our experience over the course of 15 years and other tragic stories, what we found is even 6 months, if you're in a foreign country and you're advocating for someone who has long-term health trauma, you need to be able to stay there beyond maybe that 6-month window. So we advise a year. I think the United States Department of State actually says 6 months, but sometimes we found that actually didn't really work, because people have to come back and forth and manage life here as well as abroad. So that's the reason that we at Depart Smart, when I ran the company, advised for at least a year beyond the date of return, so that you can get there and advocate and be the bedside assistance if needed.
Excellent points. And this question, I'm going to ask Chris, and I really love it. Chris, how would you deal with the case in which a student risk appetite is in direct opposition to the institution? I'm sure you've never dealt with that. So what do you do if the student has a different risk appetite than your institution, and you have to sort of govern their travel safety?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think I'm a real believer. So whilst my current role, I'm not student facing, but I'm department facing. So be really clear with the department about why. So it's not a personal thing. It's not a decision that we make to hamper or to reduce the likelihood of anyone enjoying their student experience. So I think it's to communicate with the department really clearly, have an evidence base for it, so that our students aren't left feeling unsure. So I would refer students to the FCDO website, and I think make them aware of the consequences of traveling without permission. So it would be they would not be insured, for example. And I think it will be to listen as well. But I think also, I suppose, finally, what we look to do is we make those decisions dynamically. So if FCDO travel advice changes, so will ours, but it'll be, I suppose, just to summarize, to make sure that we're clear about why, and that we stress the importance of student safety trumps any kind of desire to travel abroad. So we'll just be to be really clear about why we're making the decisions that we are.
Definitely explaining why you have some sort of rule in place is very important, as opposed to just saying, no, this isn't why we do things. And I think perhaps something that Juliana spoke of earlier in terms of empowering students, making them part of the conversation. What happens if you do this? What are you going to do if you embark on this journey and sort of go against the guidance that we've implemented? How are you going to respond in that situation? And I think presenting someone with that very real scenario of, okay, what are you going to do, is maybe a little bit of a reality check in those circumstances. And then finally, there is a question regarding Travel Guard and risk assessment. So does Travel Guard have an example template of what a good risk assessment looks like? So I think that is a little bit of a complicated question, because a risk assessment is going to be ideally customized to the individual and the specific situation. So there are examples that maybe include sort of general information that are kind of a good jumping off point. But when it comes to creating something for yourself, or if you are part of an institution and you're creating formalized risk assessments, it really does need to be sort of customized. I will say, with respect to resources, a very good one to start for families and individuals would be ready.gov. So they have a wealth of information on the site, including kind of a risk assessment template. So you have a little bit of a starting point. And again, once you begin with the kind of general template, you can start to work in some of those maybe customized concerns that really apply to your profile and situation. So ready.gov will give you a very good baseline for that.
We have a really interesting question. Sheryl, if I may, I would like to direct it to you. What if you're sexually assaulted abroad? Who will help? Where should you go?
Thank you, Ed. In my experience, first, contact your embassy or your consulate. They know the laws of the country, and they know how to help you physically, mentally, and legally. In the US, you can call the Department of State. That number is 1-888-407-4747 during business hours, or after hours, call 202-647-5225. Your country will also have similar contact phone numbers. RAIN is an international sexual assault resource crisis line that we've used historically in the past, and they've been incredibly helpful. The University of Minnesota created a handbook with considerations by country with the International Centers for Survivors of Sexual Assault. That is a wonderful resource before you travel. Your travel insurance company has your best interests at heart, your trusted parent or guardian, if you decide. And in my experience, if you're going to call your university, you need to speak with a rape crisis trained responder. Chris, would you help me with that? Could you add a little more?
Yeah, thank you, Sheryl. And I'll talk through that and around kind of what students might expect from a university. So certainly in the UK, the responses to sexual assault is really topical sector-wide, and it's a part of kind of continuing to develop good responses to consumer rights. So in the UK context, a lot of universities have a tool called Report and Support. So this will put anyone who's a staff or student who's experienced domestic abuse or sexual abuse in touch with the wellbeing support team. Some universities have specially trained independent sexual and domestic violence advisors available. other universities will use their in-house wellbeing staff. But what that is a team of support staff to do a few things to support students to disclose and to keep them informed about what they, so that's supposed to help students make informed choices about what their decisions are, and also to support in outreach and referral. So it's a developing program of work for universities in terms of like responsive approaches to sexual misconduct, and then the professionalization of that area of work. So it's just supposed to add to that point around what should universities do, or what will they continue to do. So, you know, in the UK, the universities have a responsibility to follow Office for Students guidance. So that's the sector regulator. So to be aware of sector regulations and expectations is really important. I think being trauma informed is really important as well. So this is where report and support is such a good tool, because there are 6 principles of trauma informed care, and one of them is about empowerment. So what universities should be looking to do is to support students to be aware of the options, and then to support their autonomy to make a decision. And that kind of helps, that reduces the likelihood of re-traumatizing victims. Penultimately, universities should continue to evolve practice because sector responses to sexual misconduct are changing. And finally, it's really important to learn from wider universities. I would caveat that my kind of responses here, I have a specialism in responses to domestic abuse and sexual misconduct. So some of my my non-university work has informed my answer there, but it's still very much appropriate. So thanks, Sheryl, for that.
Thank you.
Okay, so the question that I have is, I use Instagram to record and share my travel experiences with my friends. Everyone does. Are there any do's or don'ts for social media and traveling? I would say yes. There are a number of things that you really should consider when you are using social media abroad. First and foremost, don't post information on your location while you're there, and be really careful when you're geotagging your posts. So for example, if you post pictures of the hotel spa while you're still there and you tag the hotel, anybody with access to your posts would be able to easily track you down. I recommend making your accounts all private before you go, and only allowing people you know and trust in real life to follow you and have access to your posts. Also, I know that it is really popular to do, but don't post pictures of your boarding pass or passport. It is so important to think about the information you're posting online, especially if it's sensitive, and how it could be used by someone with bad intentions. Additionally, some governments do check travelers' social media, and that can really cause issues for travelers. So make sure that you are considering the legal, political, and cultural sensitivities for your destination. For example, if you're going to study abroad in China, I wouldn't recommend posting things about Taiwan, because that is a pretty sensitive topic there. Or if you identify as LGBTQ and you're going to Uganda, where homosexuality is illegal, it's best to go ahead and remove any content that would identify you as LGBTQ, just to make sure that they can't find any information that they could use against you if they go looking.
All right, thank you so much, Juliana. And another question, this one for Ed. So Ed, speaking about online safety, what about the LGBTQ apps? Are those okay to use abroad?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Yes, I say yes, you're going to use them. But with some of the same caveats that Julie shared and some other thoughts. So using LGBTQ apps abroad really requires careful consideration of both legal and safety risks. As I mentioned a little bit earlier, in many countries, same-sex relationships and gender nonconformity are criminalized or marginalized. And even when they aren't, other laws may be used to target LGBTQ individuals. Also, as we discussed, social acceptance varies widely. Being out in public or online could attract unwanted attention. So with respect to digital safety concerns, many LGBTQ apps use geolocation, potentially exposing your whereabouts to authorities or bad actors. In some countries, law enforcement has used these apps for entrapment or blackmail. Here are a few safety tips. Research local laws and societal norms before using the apps. Disable geolocation and avoid sharing personal details. If available, use a web version instead of a mobile app for added privacy. And if you're meeting someone, choose a safe public space and let someone that you know and trust know your plans. With the right precautions, LGBTQ travelers can use these apps more safely while traveling abroad.
Great points, Ed. And I think it's also important to note that when you're traveling abroad, it's not just you that you're trying to keep safe. You want to make sure that anyone in your destination that you meet is safe too. So when you are meeting new people, there may be different attitudes toward LGBTQ, locals versus travelers. So it's always important to keep that in mind. So you make sure that any new friends you meet are also just as safe as you are. So our final question is it correct that some prescribed medications are illegal in Europe? Is this a rare occurrence? And how can I check if mine are okay? So the answer to that question is yes. There are medications that are, for example, commonly prescribed in the US that are illegal abroad, but not just in Europe. So for example, if we talk about the Asia Pacific region, there are a number of countries where commonly prescribed ADHD medications are illegal. And there isn't a way to get any sort of doctor's exception for that. So in addition to, considering that you can't bring in your medications, the penalties are very severe. You also, as a traveler, have to consider what the impact of not being able to take that medication is going to be. And certainly if you're studying abroad, that's going to be a big consideration. The question about how to figure out if your medications are legal in the countries in which you're traveling is a little bit more complicated. So there's no central repository for this information. And in many cases, there are government sources. So the country in which you're traveling may have some form of information with a list, but it's not necessarily guaranteed to be up to date. So that's a good jumping off point. It's always best to look for those primary source documents for something as important as this. So you want to make sure that you're not going to just, kind of a general information site. You want to look for official government sources as a jumping off point for that information. After that, I would recommend actually making contact with the diplomatic representation in your destination country so that you can talk through any of the specifics and get the most up-to-date information. And do keep in mind that this actually applies not just to prescription medications, but it can also apply to over-the-counter medications. And there are certain medications that you can get in your own country, but you may not be able to bring that medication into another country, or you may not be able to bring certain dosages or quantities of that medication into another country. So again, a very complicated question, very complicated associated answer, but it does require a little bit of legwork. And because of the legal ramifications and your own health ramifications, it is really, really important to do that research. That is the end of our Q&A. So first, I want to thank all of our panelists for joining us today. I appreciate your insight and wisdom, and it was a pleasure speaking with you. And thank you so much to our audience for joining us.